To our last main presentation today. And our next presenter, Dr. Helen Xu, is a Director of Outreach, an Asian American specialist, and lecturer at Stanford University. She is the president of the American Psychological Association Division 45, which is the Society for the Study of Race, Culture, and Ethnicity. And she's also a past president and fellow of the Asian American Psychological Association, and past chair of the Training Advisory Committee at the American Psychological Association Minority Fellowship Program. And she is a bicultural, bilingual clinician whose work has focused primarily on working with intersectional diverse communities, and as well as culturally responsive treatment, parenting education, school-based clinical services, grief and loss, and the mentorship and leadership training of psychology students. Dr. Xu is on the advisory board for the JED Foundation, which focuses on teen and young adult suicide prevention. And she's been recognized with the Cultural Responsiveness Professional Award by the Alameda County Mental Health Advisory Board and the Akura Community Leadership Award. And she's also the founder of Helen Mental Health, which provides training and consultation for clinical training sites and corporate and entertainment clients. And lastly, she is the clinical lead for Pandora Bio, which is a precision mental health detection tool for young adults. And so with that being said, join me in welcoming Dr. Helen Xu for this last presentation on alliance and coalition building.
Thank you. Let's get our technology up. Take a bio break if you need, y'all. It's afternoon. Thank you for staying. And there is obviously such a wealth of clinical wisdom in this room, and I'm really excited that the next step is going to be actually networking time, so that you all actually have a chance to share and discuss more. But I was really pleased, thank you to Lotus Project, to have a time to talk about coalition building. That bio was way too long, but that's what happens when you've been doing this a very long time. Just saying earlier, I am now an academic and clinical grandma. But one of the things that I really learned in a lot of my projects is the most important thing I learned in this work was not from my doctoral degree, it was from my Asian American Studies degree, and it was from community-based clinics. People now will say, oh, you're at Stanford. Okay, everything important I learned at Asian Community Mental Health Services in Oakland or at Asian Pacific Family Center in LA. But how do we actually do coalition building? I was talking to Professor Zhang briefly out there. We don't have political education. We don't teach clinicians and we don't teach our students about how do we actually get to the places of power. Who am I? My bio is too long, you've read that. But just positionality, this is where I'm coming from. The most important part of my work, I think, is actually the coalition building. It's about the pipeline of who comes to do the work that has their own expertise, and how do we leverage alliances when there are constantly forces trying to split us from each other within the AA and HPI community, as well as our allied communities. And so it's really these other roles that I feel has been allowed me to make more impact, because as many of you know, as an individual therapist, you start to get frustrated that I am helping and doing this deep work, but it's one person at a time. And there's a lot more that can be done from a systems view. I share these also as a land acknowledgement. I don't read the Stanford land acknowledgement. I don't find it useful unless you put your actions where your mouth is. So giving is actually a way that I actually actualize the land acknowledgement that I come from unceded Mowakama Ohlone lands. At the core of all this is values, the values of our work as clinicians. And there's a lot of things I'm going to zip through, but you can look up, because again, I'm just here to bring you a lot of great work that already exists. A lot of us come from a place that is really about this idea of community actualization is where our healing comes from. Cultural perpetuity, this intergenerational resilience, is where we actually heal. But most of us were trained in a Maslow model, a Western individualistic model, right? I believe there was a study that said something like 90+% of the English language literature and psychology is on the weird community, Western educated, industrial, rich, democratic. Obviously, the people of the global majority have had a much longer work on healing and different models of what is the aim of life, what is health. And community actualization to me includes all communities, the people of the global majority. So this is just something I really suggest, if you have not seen this before, that you've probably not heard that Maslow's famous hierarchy was built after he had spent time with the Blackfoot Nation. So when we do get into breakouts and all of this, I really hope you will be able to share your struggles as well as your assets with each other, and do that respectfully with permissions, stay engaged in the late afternoon, but we have a wealth of wisdom here and using radical, respectful candor with each other. But ask yourself a little bit. Dr. Julie Green and Sherry Wang, and we were supposed to present at the now postponed National Multicultural Conference. We realized that the most important thing in our work has been collaborative in projects, and yet none of us ever took a class in this. I don't know if your grad school has ever provided it. Who actually teaches us those values and then those skills? When have we ever actually seen it in practice? Is it actually valued in our professions? One of the reasons I actually finally left my beloved community mental health after 20 years was I started to feel more like an auditor than a clinician or a helper, right? We were rewarded for units and charts and billing, but was it really the work that the community needed? And really examining the long-term plan besides just what we need to do now. And I also want to acknowledge that within our communities, we have so much separations. There's a whole other training to talk about how it wasn't until the 60s that Asian Americans as a concept existed, and that it's a political concept that's drawing together different groups because we had to fight for our rights here together, but that we still have a lot of work to do within our own communities as well. If you look up Lily Zhang on LinkedIn, they are the most incredible Jedi expert that I could really highly recommend. So really about what does it mean to be in solidarity in practice, not just words. That we are in a time that we are really struggling to figure out where is a safe harbor, and that it has to be with one another. We're in a place of years of like AAPI hate, which Professor John provided the background, is not a new experience. It's been around for as long as we have been in this country. And also great loss. Kanlugan is the Filipino online memorial to lost healthcare workers. We're also in a time of great grief from violence, but also still COVID. You know, we've lost more Filipino healthcare workers to COVID deaths in this country than in the Philippines. All the ways that our systems are impacting our communities right now. And highly recommend the hot off the press paper that can get into this more than I can. At the intersection of the model minority myth and anti-Blackness, racial triangulation. So Asian American triangulation recommendations for solidarity. So that literally, Wang and Santos came out like earlier this month. But what is racial triangulation? Again, Professor John had mentioned the ways that in this paper they studied how we as Asian Americans simultaneously perpetrate and suffer from racial triangulation, that sometimes we benefit. Yeah, I am the model minority, like you should hire me or you should trust me in this thing and it serves me. And that, unfortunately, many of our community really embrace that. We are the better minority or whatever. We are also victims and perpetrators of anti-Asian racism and anti-Blackness within our communities. And that there haven't been enough spaces to really address that. So that is something that exists in how we work. The model minority myth has been around since, I believe, the late 60s, and it has always been used as a wedge. So one of the examples historically, what do I mean that everything I learned important was from Asian American studies? Well, that There are reasons I think we are not taught certain histories that would help our coalitions. Do they tell you that we only have birthright citizenship because a Chinese American man sued the federal government and that benefits everyone? Or that Southeast Asian refugees, their ability to be able to come here after the horrors of war was largely fought for by Black congresspeople? That Cesar Chavez had more success with the farm workers' strike only when also joining forces with Filipino Americans and Larry Leon. I don't think the powers that be want us to know that this is how we actually get coalition work done. That by ourselves, we don't get the funding, the voice, but how do we do it in our communities? You know, there are small examples. We recently had the Stanford Black Community Service Center and Asian American Activity Center co-sponsored a mixed heritage group for Mental Health Awareness Month, which we'd never done before at Stanford. And the students came out and said, we need more of this. There's a CODAPAR grant, that is a long acronym for basically multi-divisional work within APA, the American Psychological Association, under the leadership of SPICY. We love acronyms. Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. I highly recommend looking at SPICY because the year-long grant was from 8 different divisions, but it's creating a year-long policy-relevant research webinar. So the webinars are recorded, so 2 of them have been done now, they're online, and they both come with toolkits. And what these are is how do you actually make your research matter to policy? To where the funding and the decisions get made. How do you get started? And that is all under the work of SPICY, and it's a coalition of 8 divisions. And what do other solidarity movements look like, right? And it can be even relatively small things. That was AAPA in Denver in 2016 at a Black Lives Matter rally. In 2016, we had not yet lost our brother George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, we had lost others. And this was a somewhat controversial decision by APA at that time. And did we lose some members? Yes, actually. But was it critical, I realized later, in actually showing the solidarity that we needed with ABPSI, our partners in the Association of Black Psychologists? It was. I felt like it was the very least we could do. It was such a small nothing to be at this rally and to fundraise with these shirts. But I realized later from my colleagues in ABPSI that almost no one was willing to stand up at that time in 2016. And it was a trust gaining thing that had happened. Going to alliance meetings, actually going to one another's conventions. I mean, shout out to all of you who are not AA and HPI who are here. How many of us do venture into other spaces and fully face on and address the areas of our own humility and our own learning? One of the greatest gifts of being AAPA president was having the opportunities to go to NLPA, ABPSI, TUSIP, into these other spaces. And then collaborating together once we actually knew each other, like all of our ethnic psychological orgs, having, for example, a major project with Facebook for BIPOC Mental Health Month. And that was a whole campaign that had rolled out that we worked on together. We presented on webinars and ethics panels. The Minority Fellowship Program of the American Psychological Association, highly recommend for students and early career people. There's a master's and a doctoral level program that connects people to mentoring and prepares them for leadership, and again, in a collaborative manner. And we often ask, especially these last few years, I often say, are you an accomplice and not just an ally? And we could talk more about what that means. Dr. Bettina Love talks about often, we think the work of fighting oppression is intellectual. The real work is personal, emotional, spiritual, and communal. They've also talked about an ally could be someone who maybe reads the books, puts up the sticker, says supportive things to you. But when it comes to putting in the work, who shows up for you or not? And have you shown up for others or not? And those are very serious questions we need to ask when things are actually kind of difficult. You know, walking around in Colorado in a Black Lives Matter shirt in 2016, we actually got a lot of hostility. But it actually really hurt me to realize, like, if I'm just getting this hostility for wearing this shirt, what is it like to walk around in this town in a black skin, right? And And it is really like the least we can do. And how do you prove you're an accomplice and a co-conspirator, and putting risk there? She also gave the example of when Bree Newsom climbed up a flagpole to take down a Confederate flag. There was a white man accomplice at the bottom who was there when she came down to help protect her safety when they came to arrest her, literally putting his body in place, knowing that he had more privilege than she did. So our primary coalition, where I've managed to do so much work and grown so much in the past many years, are these spaces. Highly recommend you check out all of them. Incredible experts and resources available in all of them. Association of Black Psychologists, the Asian American Psychological Association, National Latinx Psychological Association, Amina Sai, Association of Middle Eastern North African Psychologists, the Society of Indian Psychologists, and I'm current president of Division 45, Society for the Psychological Study of Culture, Ethnicity, and Race. Which, by the way, I'm not a clinician. I mean, I'm not a researcher, but I'm there largely because of this gap that we've had between academia and community work, and how, again, this is another kind of collaboration that we really need. So, earning trust. This is one of the main things to talk about. If I had to boil down to two things, it's earning trust, and how do we actually build these things? And repair skills. Because let's be honest, we also don't talk about how this is actually really hard. That we do let each other down. We do have different priorities. How do we do the repair skills when this work gets really hard, as it will? And that's what I hope we'll have time to kind of talk about later. You know, just a process example that we started out as CMPIANI. I told you about the acronyms. Council of National Psychological Associations for the Advancement of Ethnic Minority Interests. Okay. And then it became the Alliance, and then we're now the Coalition. And along the way, we've lost a member. The American Psychological Association actually dropped out because they really weren't really ready to commit what we had hoped they'd be ready to commit for ethnic psych mental health needs, which says something. So there's been a lot of changing leadership. We all have different priorities in our groups. Our projects keep changing, which has actually been amazing, but again, who juggles these and how do we prioritize this? The importance of administrative roles like history keeping. How was this done? What went wrong? Where did this funding come from? How did we do this? We realize that is so important. And when there is harm, how do we make repairs? And how do we do equity and resource allocations? Because there have been breakdowns behind the scenes. You know, it isn't all been like, oh, it's so great, we all work together. Talk a little bit about some of those. I will highly recommend you look up the Health and Human Services Multicultural Coalitions Guide, because there's a lot of detail laid out there that I definitely can't get into today, but there's a whole guidebook already. So look up the guide online, and they really emphasize and break it down into creating a coalition, space for connection, you know, what are the shared goals and values that we are here for, commit, and to me commit means a lot too about repair, and then celebrate, right? How do we actually share, celebrate? I think culture is important, and of course these days everything you do. Celebrate also means data dissemination and also social media presence, right? But like all of those things about communication. So definitely look up the guide for more details and examples of what does a multicultural coalition look like. And I'll spend a little more time talking about create, connect, and commit. Celebrate, I feel like we're really good at that, and we will get there. One project example. The California Reducing Disparities Project. You can also look that up online. It's a multi-year project from the state of California, funded by Mental Health Services Act funds. Which I will also say, another aside, is that one of my peeves is we aren't given a political education. We're also not told how we pace ourselves. The Mental Health Services Act, I remember collecting signatures at a party on a petition just to get it on a ballot. And it actually got voted in. It was 15 years before I actually saw results. It was 15 grueling years. First it was the petitions, then it's on the ballot, then it's a vote, Then we were super happy. Then I was on a work group, and then I was in these work group meetings like, this is taking forever. But on and on, but it takes 15 years, so we have to pace ourselves, and again, the record keeping, the labor sharing, pacing, knowing how the system works. But now we have millions of dollars for years because of that act. So that is one example too of a multicultural coalition throughout communities. So MHSA helped fund the California Reducing Disparities Project. Statewide project examining culturally responsive clinical interventions, just like we've been talking about all day. Actually looking at, we know that evidence-based therapy is not made on evidence from our communities, that there's almost no evidence. So CRDP was trying to look at models and examine from 5 primary communities were identified for the project. So Indigenous and Native, Asian American Pacific Islander, African American Black communities, Latinx communities, and LGBTQ communities were the targets. So the actions of creating, okay, we have to start meeting. Who even should be included in these spaces? Who needs to be at the table? How do we connect? Do we even know each other? Who trusts each other? Who has demonstrated, and because of the relationships built over our projects with the APA, with the APSI, and otherwise, that there was trust. Do we meet? And we have met in real life. We have shown up in real life and done things. We have made repairs. That's our commitment. A small example of that is that there was a multicultural project to create a video about racial trauma and resilience. And everybody was a part of it, and we were all very excited. And then when it came out, there was no Asian American person, really. And APA wasn't really in there. And it caused a lot of hurt and confusion because videos were made of Asian American experts from AAPA, and we had to go and say, excuse me, this is really wonderful, and yet, why are we invisible again? And there was a lot of hurt because then some of our colleagues from other communities of color felt like you all are calling us out in front of the white people, the funders, and making us look bad. And we all had to sit with you feel hurt by that, but we feel hurt by you invisibilized us. And we're not saying it was intentional, but it is what happened. And then the one person who was in the video who's half Asian felt totally messed up, am I not Asian enough? Did I not do something right? I mean, there was a lot of hurt and misunderstanding that we had to work through. But we commit. You can't just throw away a person or a project because we're having problems, right? So that was an example of a repair that had to happen. A lot of very painful, difficult dialogues. What were the asks? We're creating a work plan. What is CRDP going to do? What does the state want us to do? What are we going to do in our communities? Showing up for those tasks, right? Aligning in what our goals are. What were the policies? We had to have very specific, clear contracts. And present, who needs to be there? Committing the support, the labor that each of our partner orgs had to commit was not small. This is a years long project. And within groups too, we had to commit. The Asian American Psych Association had to look at our project contract, our piece of the programs we were evaluating, and say, we have to find an Afghan and a Hmong evaluator. Because there are pieces of this that we're evaluating that none of us who are currently on this project really are qualified to, right? So at every level, we have to commit to, are we doing this right? Being able to take the feedback and find and include the experts that we need. We shared the grant money and the funding. Dr. Cheryl Brills, past president of ABSI, is actually phenomenal at funding and pulling together things, and also sharing those with other allied communities and co-creating what that is. And then how do you actually share those resources? For example, some of us voted to share some funding with the Society of Indian Psychologists because they are the smallest of the ethnic psychology orgs and didn't have as many members nor funds to do things like go to DC for meetings or what have you. So are we committed to this? Can we resource share on these really important things? So CRDP was a statewide example, and one of the examples you can look at on the Asian American Psych Association website is actual congressional testimony that came from AAPA about the harms to Asian American communities during COVID. That was also brought to us by our partnership with Cheryl Girls from AB Side, who was in talks with Karen Bass, who was a congressperson. And we found ourselves in a meeting with the congressional caucuses. So they called them Congressional Caucus +2. So the Latinx congressional people, the Asian American cohort, the Black Congressional Caucus +2 are two Indigenous Native American congressional caucuses that they knew if they did not set aside the money to do the research about needs in our communities, that we would all be left out of the federal funding. So these are things about thinking about policy, right? That we all do such important, valuable work, but are we in our silos? We have to share the resources and the knowledge, because we all are so tired. And as I tell my students, this is lifetime work, so you've got to pace yourself and not feel bad about when you do need your self-care or whatever, because the work will always be there. But how do we actually share it to make it lighter? So being able to put things on webinars now, being able to put toolkits out and say, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have models for how CRDP worked. There are examples of programs. On the SBITC website, the toolbox is about policy relevant research. That's what it could look like, and the Multicultural Coalition Handbook. So maybe later in our networking time to actually think about, were there experiences you had that built trust or facilitated collaboration? How is that actually done? Or that actually helped you co-create repair or understanding? Unfortunately, in times of strife is often when we find out who our allies are. That, in the microcosm of Stanford, during the pretty horrific few years that we had, when you talk about building trust, that, say, very shortly after the murder of George Floyd, that our very few Black staff, I was like, well, what can I do? All I can do is buy you food, not make any more demands on your mental space or time. I want to support the Black Lives Matter vigil that Stanford had for the first time ever, and I will accept whatever role. This is not about me. I don't need to talk. What can I do? And then after the Atlanta spa shootings, I really noticed, after those murders, that it was only the other people of the global majority, BIPOC colleagues, who actually reached out to me with specific aid. Not just oh my God, I feel so bad, how are you? But let me take an intake off your caseload. Let me do something for you, right? Actual aid. Are we offering that to each other? Does your workplace offer that to each other? What would that look like? And so I won't have time to do this, but we will have our networking time later, but really hoping that you take the time to assess or take it to management. What is your agency currently doing to build coalition and address impact of anti-Asian hate for your clients? What do you and your organization need to do to improve your coalition building and maintenance? My favorite thing I get to do as a director of outreach at Stanford is get out of the clinic. Go to the community centers, off campus, to other departments. As a flaming atheist, it's very funny to me that my favorite partners on campus are the Office of Spiritual and Religious Life, because we have partnered together so often after crises and in our grief work. So getting out of what our box is, as even during the first, after Professor Jung's talk about, our community's healing may be in a non-clinical place. It may be a spiritual place, a physical place, an artistic place. Have we made any of those connections? And let's really think about an idea or projects of yours, something you're currently thinking about or might be underway, something you're seeking to be a part of. And then, you can access, of course, this whole slide afterward, typos and all, but briefly identify your own actions, asks, policies, and resources needed so that you can discuss what is it that you need to be prepared to create, collaborate, and commit in collaboration, right? What would it look like for you to fill in those things with your partners or potential partners? or brainstorming with your own administration and your funders. And we would often bring this to the county level, which is maybe the most directly relevant when we're talking about community-based mental health agencies. I realized many years later that Dr. Connie Louie, my first supervisor at ACMHS, like she was giving me the leadership education that I didn't get anywhere because that was my first postdoc job. And she would take me to county meetings and say, this is who decides this. This is where this decision gets made. This is how the funding comes down to this. And I realized as clinicians, often those things are really fuzzy and not clear to us. Where is the room where it happens? And we should be there, because we're often not. And I definitely saw that when I did K-12 school-based. You had a superintendent or an appointed person making mental health decisions who knew nothing about mental health for these thousands of students. We need to figure out where we need to be to make it happen. And how do we actually grow that collaboration and then maintain it even when it's difficult and we have to do repairs or education. So this is lifelong generational work. Humility and generosity go a long, long way. You know, we talked about intergenerational trauma. I have had family members who said things like, why do you volunteer so much service time? You should be getting paid. You could be getting paid more. Because they're coming from a very scarcity background, you know, where I'm 20 years in now and I've given a lot, but I feel like I've gotten so much more back. And investing in that trust building and those relationships has been absolutely phenomenal to my community. Getting on the California-wide project, getting on the national project to do the congressional testimony, those are not things I could have done on my own. Those are not things my org could have done on our own. So think strategically. And all your evaluations have to include community members from the get-go. Keep the records and history, that is so important. I can't tell you how much time we've wasted being like, what did we do? Who did this? Looking things up. So definitely keep that. Of course, disaggregated data, because East Asians hog up so much space in this area. What is the actual data? And of course, when you are going along the processes. Yes, this work is never done, but there is a lot to celebrate on the way. And I think we can go talk amongst ourselves now. Thank you.
So we'll have 5 minutes of Q&A like with previous presentations. Anyone who has questions, please raise your hand. Okay.
Thank you so much for your presentation and bringing together both the clinical and the collaborative community-based elements. I really appreciate that. Just a very specific question. What did SPSSI stand for again? And how
SPSSI, yes, thank you. Please look up SPSSI. Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues.
And are they connected to Stanford? Is it open to community members?
No, they're open. They're actually a part of the American Psychological Association.
Thank you.
But yes, they have fantastic resources there, including everything from the policy relevant research series is and will be posted there.
Other questions?
Yes, I named a lot of fabulous projects. Y'all look them all up.
Yeah, so thank you for a great presentation. And my question is that sometimes as a clinician who works with our clients on-on-one basis, I know that the policy level change and coalition, the community work is important, but sometimes like feels there's a huge gap between the daily work, the daily role, and kind of being a part of that kind of levels change work. So what would be your kind of advices that you could give us who feel like I'm a kind of average, ordinary, like one-on-one therapist. Yeah.
Well, I know you're an outstanding therapist, actually, but as the feminists would say since the 60s, right, the personal is political. I do think giving our clients and students a little bit of political education is incredibly liberating and empowering. You know, changing their own narrative, right, from like, one of my classes were like, so what was most impactful about class? And it was not any of my lesson plans. It was just one of the students said, you mentioned that, right, it's like externalizing the problem, that the problem isn't me, it's the system, right? That she'd always sort of grown up in a community where she felt being Southeast Asian refugee was the problem, or she was told that being a woman was the problem. That she literally sat in a psych class and they said, you know what the #1 risk for depression is? Being a woman. No, it's not. The #1 risk for depression is being in a sexist society that threatens violence all the time, right? I think that piece alone is so pivotal. It's that narrative, right? That I also, in a book that I'm writing, I also cite Viet Thanh Nguyen talking about narrative plenitude. And I cite Ocean Vuong a lot, where he talks about the survival stories and the creativity that comes from being a survivor. Giving a little piece of that mind frame, I think, even to our individual clients is really something. For all of our like Stanford students who have rife with imposter syndrome, you know, we really talk about like, you belong here. And this place, this gorgeous fancy place, was built with Chinese labor on Chinese-made money in the railroads, you know, like nobody owns this place and it's on unceded stolen land. Like nobody else has any more reason to be here than you as well. What's your piece in this, right? This wholeness. We're trying to regain our individual wholeness. We're also trying to regain our wholeness like in community and space.
I know there was a question over here. It's okay. Oh.
Our storytelling person, I'm all for it. Okay.
So thank you so much for your presentation. It was really invigorating, especially during the post-lunch coma of, you know, digestion. It's like, oh, I'm really woken up. I have a really simple question, which is, since this is a mental health workshop, and I think as Asians, we often, wittingly or unwittingly, participate in the hard-working, productive aspect of the modern minority myth. What kind of self-care practice do you turn to?
Mm-hmm. I love that. Self-care, self-preservation. Yes. I, too, was raised in a family where we were so proud that we never took vacations and we worked every weekend. Until my guts basically like slapped me and stopped me in my tracks during my grad school years. So now I really try to deprogram the students, too. I'm like, why do it the hard way? You're going to have to make time to be sick if you don't make time to be healthy. And so I do. I have figured out, I tell everyone, you have to figure out your own modality. Like some people like yoga, some people like watching TV, like whatever it is for you. I think for me, very much the way I eat and my levels of physical activity and the fact that I basically stopped speaking to anybody on the phone since 1996 because I just needed a certain amount of space. And like now nobody speaks on the phone, but back then it was pretty odd. But figuring out where those boundaries were for myself that I needed and finding the people in my life that I needed who kind of can understand that was really important, right? Because the values work. And I'm very fortunate, I feel like, to have a partner and a community and a family that has let me do my weird thing. So let me tell you, being a bad student who almost wanted to drop out and being a non-traditional student was in many ways very liberating because nobody ever expected me to do certain things, and that actually was very liberating in a way that I don't see with a lot of our high achievers like at Stanford, that there's this terror of disappointing people or straying from the norm, that if you've already like fallen off of that pedestal, it's like, it's fine. But yeah, I mean, like clearly things like when I found my current like physical health exercise practices, I actually noticed like a huge decline in like seasonal affective symptoms. Like it was very noticeable. And so when people say like, oh, you're so disciplined, how do you keep that up? Or I'm not doing my work or my writing right now because I'm going to work out, but it's because I've seen it makes a huge difference. And then also coalitions help my own mental health, because when I feel that this country is really going down the tubes, and I'm very worried about the state of the entire world as well, I get to be in spaces with people that I really respect and admire, and that helps me too.
I think this will be our last question.
Hi, 15 years is a lot. How did you not give up? And how did you not give up when, say, your life was not as stable, if that was ever the case?
Yes, that's where I say like pacing yourself. And some of our young activists, they get really burnt out. And I saw, I mean, at ACNHS, which no longer exists, you know, in its own format, I saw a lot of people burn out. People who gave so much so fast to their communities that it just like destroyed them. So I think there is this level of pacing. And in the 15 years for Mental Health Services Act, I wasn't deeply involved the whole time. There were times that I threw up my hands and was like, okay, like, this is where I'm piecing out, and you all are continuing the work group, you know, and so everyone has a role in that, and needing to be realistic about yours, like, you know, yes, Dr. Chan talked about like what are boundaries, right? And I often say, you know, boundaries are where I can love you and love me at the same time, and so like knowing that there are seasons that I can do more and less. I can do a lot now, and it looks great, but that's because I have built this community that supports me, and I'm older and more stable, you know, and I feel that those of us who've earned any degree of privilege have an obligation to use it. But when you don't yet, you also shouldn't feel bad that like, I just need to get licensed or get stable in my life or take care of my health right now. So just knowing that process. And then for myself too, having elders who are able to say like, yes, it's gonna take X many more years. Or we have to take turns being at these meetings because it's just going to deplete, you know, one person to try to do it. So, and I've seen that too, you know, being at meetings with fellow mental health providers who are just completely, really suffering with their own mental health or their family or emotional relationships. And like that is a line you have to figure out, like, this is not my season. You know, I'll come back after this other milestone or whatever. And knowing your style, like not everyone is going to show up and yell at a demonstration or speak publicly because they hate it, you know, what is it that you're good at? You know, sometimes I speak, sometimes I send money, sometimes do other things. Like there's so many ways that you can be a part of coalition building or solutions and health and not getting too bad in the shoulds, I think. That is easy to do in all of these roles. Because yes, this is lifelong work.
Thank you. Thanks.